Hi, everyone. We're talking to Campbell Moreira today, and he is quite knowledgeable about plasma and ball lightning. So that's what he's going to talk about. Campbell, why don't you give us a little bit of a background sweep and how you got into plasma and ball lightning?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for having me on. It's really great to be here and chatting with you. I love your series.
Thank-
I I first got interested in UFOs very recently, and that's sometimes makes people raise their eyebrows. But I cite everything one to one that I reference, so it's not about me at all, and that's what I think science should be about. That said, there is some value in knowing who I am generally. I grew up in Ottawa, Canada. I went to University of Ottawa, got a degree in analytic philosophy, went on to Queen's University's Juris Doctor program. I dropped out after the first year. I realized I didn't want to be a lawyer. So a little bit disillusioned after that experience. And then Canada federally legalized cannabis, and I fortunately was in a position. My grandparents had an old abandoned farm, and they left it to my brother and I. And my wife supported me in taking 3 years to clear the land and start my own farm business. And I got my federal license, and now I'm federally licensed to cultivate cannabis for commercial sale, and that's what I do with my time. I have been interested for the last 10 years in atheist skepticism. That's what I mainly consumed in terms of debates and podcasts and things like that. So I have a lot of experience hearing the discussions between sort of people focused on the scientific method and people sort of coming at it from a more believer mentality, and I have a lot of sympathy for that, and I like to engage with believers and try to come at it from a position of compassion, not just out of the goodness of my own heart. There's also a lot of scientific evidence that shows that when you create an us versus them mentality in the person you're talking with, that's the strongest way to prevent them from listening to what you're saying. So if we're going to be engaging with believers from as people oriented from science, I think we should follow the science of communication. And so it was last spring, only in May 17th or 18th, 2021, when President Obama went on James Corden's show and gave that very specific comment where he said, well, I'm going to be serious. There are objects in the skies. We don't know exactly what they are. And, I think people still take seriously trying to investigate what that is. And I didn't think he was saying, oh, there are aliens in the sky and stuff. I had zero history engaging with the paranormal outside of just the religious component through the atheist skepticism. But for some reason, Obama sort of suggesting there might be something to it made me wonder what was going on, not from, oh, it's aliens, but from, is the US government kind of trying to get me to think about UFOs for some reason? I was just curious from that. And that led me into the trying to figure out from an academic perspective what was going on. And when you look up UAP in research databases like ResearchGate, a bunch of peer-reviewed published papers about ball lightning come up. And there are dozens that directly reference that all these physicists think that UFOs are ball lightning. And then I found that in 2014, Physical Review Letters, Optical and Spectral Characteristics of Ball Lightning was published, and it's not contested. And Brian Dunning's publication, Skeptoid, has even published saying that they accept the data, the reality of the phenomenon. So it got me really interested from that perspective.
Tell us about your website, UAP Study, and some of the more interesting things that you've documented on it.
Yeah, when I started to engage with the subject, I was trying to speak to people through the generic forums like Reddit and stuff, and I could not find anybody who had any interest in talking about these peer-reviewed papers by physicists saying that they think that UFOs are ball lightning. And a number of people were like saying to me immediately, like, oh, you're just trying to discount it, you're trying to disprove it. And I'm like, no, I don't. This is my sort of my motto. I don't care if UFOs exist, and if they do exist, I don't care what they are. I'm just curious, based on this best academic evidence available, to figure out what's going on, because I'm curious because of the way that it's going down in modern culture. So I started putting together my website almost from the very beginning of starting to do research in late May of last year to provide a context for other people who might be interested in it from a scientific perspective as well, and are coming into it from the outside, don't have this history of the culture and all of this stuff sort of all changing the way that they look at it in a way that maybe influences it away from science. And even people coming out from that way, I would like it if they could take a look at this. So it's entirely unmonetized. This is entirely educational, and I wrote it out as a book. The intro, it's got chapters at the top. It's one page and it reads like a book, and that's how I intended it. Just a free, not-for-profit book for anybody to take a look at. And I document everything, hundreds of everything, like I said, directly cited to the original sources. I provide the links at the end of every sentence to the exact location, and with the paragraph number or page number. Anybody can double check everything, because I don't want it to be about me. It's just about the information. And so after I found those original ball lightning papers, the next thing, and this is sort of the thing that really got me curious about this, the next thing that I found of significance was the United Kingdom's UAP in the UK Air Defence Region report from 2000. It was declassified in 2006 via updated Freedom of Information laws. Dr. David Clark from Sheffield Hallam University, assistant professor of folklore and journalism, had put in the Freedom of Information request. He has a long history as a UFO researcher. He's a very excellent researcher. And he got this thing. And in that report, and it's been very well documented that it's a credible report by BBC News, The Guardian, Wired. They'll have reports done at the time of its release in 2006. It's been well studied since. Everything says it's a genuine internal report. It was prepared by Defense Intelligence Section 55 for the top leadership of the Ministry of Defense to fully inform them, based on the last 30 years of Ministry of Defense studies of UFOs, what UFOs really are, if they exist, and basically what the Ministry of Defense should do about it. And they commissioned it in order to essentially collate, aggregate, synthesize, wrap up the whole UFO thing, because the leadership wasn't sure what was happening with it. And that report is what just struck me as so remarkable, because it says in the introduction of the executive summary that UAP exists is indisputable. And typically people will be like, well, of course, if you're driving to work and you see something on the horizon, you can't tell what it is, that's a UAP. And then you get closer and it's a seagull. So yeah, of course UAP exists. No, this is the first sentence. And then the next sentence is, credited with the ability to hover, land, take off, accelerate it to exceptional velocities and vanish. They can outmaneuver any known aircraft or vehicle, manned or unmanned, and can alter their trajectory instantaneously, all this stuff. So they're defining it specifically in terms of the way that ufologists like J. Allen Hynek and Jacques Vallée had originally collected eyewitness reports in the 60s and 70s and so on. So that stunned me. And then it went on to say, we are almost certain. So they say they're certain that these objects do exist. And then they say we are almost certain that they are buoyant, charged gaseous masses akin to ball lightning. And when I saw that in the secret report that top UK leadership's been briefed on since 2000, and then I look back, and this is, after I saw the peer-reviewed papers, it just blew me away, because it was just, these are two independent, sources. This report is in the UK National Archives. Dr. David Clark was hired by the UK National Archives after he successfully FOIA'd all this stuff to put it up on the website and communicate about it to the public. They've been very interestingly open about it. And that whole thing just blew my mind. So that's what I would highlight as being, after the ball lightning papers directly, the next most interesting thing that I put up on that website.
Yeah, so that was the Condign Report, and the British MOD one.
Yes.
Who was the contractor who did the study for the MOD?
David Clark has an extensive paper or blog post or whatever on his website about that contractor. I don't remember his name right now off the top of my head. He was the top radar expert for the Ministry of Defense, and then he served as a contractor as well. But he had an office in the Ministry of Defense, and he was the one who produced that report.
Yep. So we'll come back to that report in a bit. But first, I want to touch on a problem, or it might not be a problem, but it's to do with how do we categorize phenomena, and do we assign a kind of catch-all term for them? And do you think that it's potentially problematic to call these atmospheric phenomena ball lightning when many of the reports by eyewitnesses claim that they're different shapes, or there's a lot of variation, right? So what are the problems in terms of adopting a catch-all term ball lightning when that may not really encapsulate the range of eyewitness testimony?
Yeah, that's a very serious question, and I have put thought into that. What I would say is that I refer exclusively to the physicists to decide how to term the things that they study. The physicists themselves, David Freiberger from the, I think is a national, I have the reference on the website, but he's a prominent physicist that worked in the United States. He wrote a series of papers about atmospheric electromagnetic phenomena, and his argument is that all of these things, big, small, various shapes, they are ball lightning electrochemically. The math is the same, and there's something called plasma scaling where you can study a tiny ball lightning in the laboratory and you can infer up, scale it up, and it's just the physics and the fluid dynamics, they all remain the same. So you can infer correctly from a very small scale to a large scale. And so it's about the energy level that produces the size, and not necessarily, so it's not a distinct phenomenon necessarily from what I've read. That said, there are distinct atmospheric electricity phenomena. Maybe some of these more extreme ones are. I'd also like to just right now very carefully define that the ball lightning in 2014 that was proven to exist was a more classic kind of ball lightning, in the sense that they observed through this sensor system a lightning stroke hit the ground, and then the ball lightning appeared as a result of that stroke. So the energy injection seemed to be from the strike, and that's why it only lasted like 1.3 seconds or something. That said, it stayed in a stable circular form, conserving its energy and such, and it drifted sideways and slightly up instead of directly up. So there are a variety of very interesting things you can infer from that. But these more extreme kinds that we would more consistently put into the category of the objects that J. Allen Hynek, Jacques Vallée, and then all these ball lightning databases, people with these more extreme representations, those things have not been proven in the same way to exist, in the sense that an optical device with resolution sufficient for spectra to definitively describe what exactly is being observed, that has not yet occurred for these more remarkable ones that the UK Ministry of Defense report says they're certain exist. However, we have a significant number of peer-reviewed papers of descriptions of these things, both by eyewitnesses and by professional physical scientists in field studies. For example, Dr. Massimo Turani, astrophysicist, Dr. Stelio Montebenoli, he's a senior engineer at the National Academy of Sciences in Italy, Jader Minari, Master of Electrical Engineering and the manager of the Medicina Radio Telescope. They've been to Hessdalen multiple times. In the early 2000s, they put in very VLF receivers, a variety of video systems. They did not have the budget for an optical system capable of capturing high resolution spectra. So even though they observed these kinds of phenomena multiple times, they say in the paper, it was published in the peer-reviewed journal, Journal of Scientific Exploration, which is not a dedicated physical sciences journal, so it's not seen as prestigious as physical review letters for good reasons. But we have a variety of very high credibility scientists who have photos of them and are simultaneously saying what they observed was seemingly these phenomena. Now, that said, we can't take their word for it. As we know from the scientific method, there needs to be this definitive high resolution spectra captured. So there's good reason to think that those do exist, but I want to be very clear that they have not yet been conclusively proven in the same way as ball lightning as a general subject has been proven.
Mm-hmm. How many different categories of anomalous or poorly understood atmospheric phenomena do you think that there are? And I guess related to that, how many mechanisms have been proposed?
Oh, geez, there are, I would say like dozens to 100 or more theories as to the exact process physically that produces this system. Now, some in the last couple of years have been more conclusively proven than others, but at the same time, in the lab, we can produce ball lightning like phenomena through a variety of different mechanisms. The most popular mechanisms are applying microwaves to various materials. It produces a jet of plasma off the material if the energy is high enough, and then the plasmoid can remain in a structured form in the energy field of the microwave. And so that's one way. You can also do one-off major electric discharges into silicon, which was done by Dr. Kirsten Paiva in Brazil in 2007. And then it creates these balls of self-contained energy that sort of run around for a few seconds. And in the size and length of time is based on the power of the discharge. And then you can do electric discharges as well, just in a water solution. And that was the method that in 2006 first brought the idea that ball lightning maybe is actually potentially a real thing at the Max Planck Institute of Plasma Physics in Germany. They replicated a Soviet experiment that did this exact thing. It produced a ball of plasma in normal atmospheric conditions through a simple process of discharging high energy electric discharge into a solution of water. So there's reason to believe that there are a variety of mechanisms that can produce these things, and then there's a variety of mechanisms that can explain their long life. One of the most probable mechanisms has to do with something called the skirmion. It's been well studied. They've been produced in the lab replicably in the last few years. And this is also new. It's part of why it's so remarkable. 2014 confirmation, now 2018, 2019, 2020, we have the skirmions being made in the lab. And it's basically a series of electromagnetic self-contained loops. They're like a vortex kind of, right? So they're self-sustaining and they can move around like, a whirlpool on the surface of water. It's self-contained, it moves around. It's similar. Plasma operates according to fluid dynamics. And that's actually reminding me right now that you mentioned the different shapes. If we look at fluid dynamics, hydrodynamics, the exact shapes that are consistently reported by people about UFOs are the exact shapes that are consistently produced in fluid dynamics with a variety of different materials and substances. It's the cylinders, the ellipsoids, the discs, the spheres. All of these things are produced by fluid dynamics. So it's fascinating to see that in the lab you can experiment and produce these shapes, and these are actually the shapes that you see on an atomic level. I have peer-reviewed papers that show these shapes that are just microscopic, and then due to the scaling you can see that there's a kin phenomena occurring in other substances, and we have not proven that these objects with these different shapes are real and are ball lightning. That's not proven, but there's good reasons to think that it's possible based on experimentation. And then we have these direct observations, obviously, that we can point to say, like, there's at least good reason to think that it might be occurring.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned there's many laboratory studies that have reproduced at least aspects of purported ball lightning, but is there a problem in terms of saying that what is in the lab, what's seen in the lab is translatable to what happens in nature?
Yes, that's a huge problem in the earth sciences. It's an excellent point, and it's an ongoing issue in the earth sciences. And actually, you asked me how many kinds, and I was talking about ball lightning, but there are a huge number of phenomena that are, well, huge number. There's a significant number that have just recently, in the last 40 years, emerged through advances in sensor system suites. And that includes red lightning, right? Sprites and elves and blue jets and what do they call it? There's that new one, Steve. They've just named it, and it's a luminous arc in the sky that's not the same as auroras borealis. There's all these different atmospheric plasma phenomena that are just in the last 40 years, up until the last, I think Steve is in the last 10 years as well, being discovered through advances in sensors. And that's also the ball lightning in 2014. So because these phenomena are really fast, transient, they happen suddenly, it's very challenging to capture them on sensor systems. And in 2014, they were actually studying lightning. They weren't out there to find ball lightning, and they just happened to capture it on this high resolution system. So that was by chance. And there's a long history in the earth sciences of it being a pure chance encounter that produces a confirmation of a phenomenon. Meteorites, infamously by J. Allen Hynek, frequently referenced as an example of this kind of thing, but he makes a decent point, even though there are problems with other things that he believed instead, that it wasn't until 1803 that the National Academy of Sciences in France and around the world accepted that meteorites were falling from the sky, because there was no known explanation, no plausible physical mechanism to explain how a rock could be up in the sky and then fall down. So you can't take people's word for it based on, the Royal Society created, take nobody's word for it, as the foundation of the modern scientific movement in the mid 1600s. And that's, they say you have to use replicable experiment to have an agreement among people who have disparate views. And that's produced so much good for us over the centuries. But it was not until 1803 in France, there was a meteor that disintegrated in the atmosphere and broke up into something like 3,000 pieces. And it was observed by a huge number of people, including scientists. And then the pieces of the rocks were all over the place. And so even though you can't replicate that thing, the National Academy of Sciences finally said, like, okay, this is enough for us to be like, okay, we can't explain what's happening, but we see that it has happened. And just one other example of that, rogue waves. The physics models for rogue waves demonstrated that based on known physics, and this is not new physics, it's just the physics that we understood at the time, a rogue wave only had a 1 in 10,000 years chance of occurring. So the safety standards were not put up very high. The European Space Agency launched a satellite like 10, 15 years ago. In the first year of its operation, it detected multiple rogue waves in the middle of the ocean. We suddenly realized, oh, wow, so we did not understand the mechanism that could explain it, but now we have the verification through a very high quality sensor system that confirms it's happening, even though the physicists were saying that's not possible, and that's not their fault. It was just that they didn't have the math yet. So we have multiple instances where the earth sciences require a conclusive one-off definitive observation through a high resolution sensor system, or in the case of France, and I don't think it would be good enough now for meteorites, but a very conclusive one-off event by chance.
Mm-hmm. Have any of the scientists that you've mentioned considered looking at Jupiter or other highly electromagnetically active planets to study these phenomena?
That's an excellent question, and I have never seen anybody make reference to that. I've seen, the closest that I'm thinking of right now are that auroras have been detected in Jupiter's atmosphere. I've seen those images. That's beautiful. And then also dust devils on Mars. I found that like fascinating that they found that. But I honestly have never seen anything about that. And I would be extremely interested if somebody proposed something like that.
Yep. So you mentioned about the scientists who finally accepted the existence of meteorites, and I guess related to that is how skeptics have regarded ball lightning. Do you think that there are, since the 2014 paper by Sen et al, have skeptics kind of fully come around to ball lightning, or is it there's still some latent resistance?
I think that in the informed circles, there, as far as I can tell, there is no resistance. That paper, because of the high resolution spectra, there is no contest at this point in the informed people. When I went onto Reddit, for example, and on like r skeptic, and would like make a comment about like, oh, ball lightning, there would be dozens of people jumping on me instantly, sending me all these YouTube videos debunking ball lightning and stuff. And then I would just post the link to the paper and then post the link to Skeptoid accepting the information. And then there would be zero negativity after that, complete acceptance. It's fascinating to see the difference that this one high resolution spectra image can make. And and I've posted on my website as well. Mick West, in I think it was January 2022, he did an interview on Out of the Blank podcast, and he was asked about atmospheric phenomena, and he specifically said, some things, some lights in the sky could be some kind of atmospheric plasma, ball lightning. He specifically says it. So he doesn't reject ball lightning's existence. And Jason Colavito, in multiple different through multiple different channels that I've quoted and directly cited, so people can see the original sources themselves on my website. He says in tweets, he's like, well, before we jump to aliens, how about we write off, seagulls and this and that and atmospheric plasma. And then he, in an interview on the radio fairly recently, I can't remember which channel, but I have the link to it on my website. He says specifically, in some of these lights might be atmospheric plasma phenomena akin to ball lightning that science has yet to completely explain. And so the most severe skeptics, most hardline, are all on page saying that this could be a factor in the UFO phenomenon. And I recognize that I've been sort of emphasizing, oh, it's like UFO, it seems like, according to the scientists and the declassified archive documents, that UFOs are ball lightning. But I also want to just emphasize for skeptics who are sort of pulling their hair out and listening to that, for every single observation, the most likely explanation for any individual observation is misperception, hallucination, or a hoax. Every time. Ball lightning is a very rare phenomenon. So it applies that almost all UFO reports are misperception of a mundane thing, hallucination, or hoax. So this is all just on top of that. I just want to be very clear.
Yes. Now, you've written about Hessdalen.
Yes.
Can you give us just a brief overview of some of the controversies surrounding Hessdalen, perhaps especially as they relate to the work and claims of Dr. Teodoranyi?
Yes. Yes, it's a very interesting series of exchanges that occurred there, and it illustrates the challenges of trying to do frontier science. And I think it's a good example that maybe will be studied in the future to derive some useful lessons from it. So in terms of Hessdalen, there was a series of high-profile. Well, let me start actually by saying Hessdalen is a valley in a rural part of Norway, about something like an hour and a half south of Trondheim, which is partway up the coast, but fairly north. And in Hessdalen in the early 80s, there was a recurring series of observations of what we would call UFOs. But what was being observed was luminous phenomena in the sky, exhibiting a variety of colors and motions and all kinds of things like that. People began coming out and doing sky watching. It became quite popular. There were all these articles about it and stuff like that. The Scandinavian UFO network was then got involved, and a individual named Erling Strand, who became more significant later, and a group of other people went out there. They got funding from University of Bergen, I believe, and also the Norwegian military gave them some equipment, and they went out and they staked out the valley for something like 55 days in the winter of 1983, 1984, and they made a significant number of reported observations. They were using a radar system. They were getting things on radar. I'll just mention that the blue book file for Minot Air Force Base, I don't know how the Americans said it, it's just the Canadians saying Minot, but MINOT, that blue book report says likely a ball lightning. Ball lightning can be painted on radar, it can do these things. So they're getting tracks on radar, and that would be consistent with ball lightning. They weren't saying it was ball lightning at the time, I just want to be clear, but so they were seeing these phenomena. That was quite surprising that it was occurring, and but scientifically we can't be saying like, oh, they did actually see them, because they weren't getting clear. They were getting photos, but they could be mundane things, and that's the thing, is because without the high resolution spectra, any unresolved light source, it could be a mundane thing. And each individual photo, it is much more likely that it is a mundane thing than it is something remarkable. And so the report that they completed was it's called like the Hessdalen Technical Report, 1984. Erling Strand wrote that. He sent it off to a bunch of people, including J. Allen Hynek. Hynek found it so fascinating, and the observations were consistent with his descriptions of what he found to be high credible eyewitnesses. That's something I haven't touched on yet, but all of his descriptions of what people were seeing are luminous phenomena. He says himself in his book, 1972, the UFO phenomenon. The UFO might be nothing more than the light. People describe the luminosity above any physical structure, all this stuff. So he went there, and Hynek, and he sort of popularized it a bit. The researchers got a lot more funding, and then they staked it out again the next winter, and they got like, I think, one observation that was poor quality. And so this is something that's occurred many times in the UFO history. There's sort of like a flap, and then it goes away. So it seemed to occur like that. But if you apparently, according to the people on site and more significantly, maybe the villagers in the valley, a couple hundred of them, a significant number were reporting that they were seeing them here and there. And it appears that due to, who knows, I mean, I don't want to speculate on the processes, but for some reason in this valley, possibly geophysical, we don't know exactly, there's a slightly higher than average prevalence of these phenomena seemingly occurring in this valley. So after that, it kind of died down, and then Erling Strand became an electrical engineer, got his master's, got hired by the University of Osvold as an assistant professor. And then in 1994, he ended up founding a conference in Hessdalen, and he got variety of ball lightning physicists, researchers from all over the world, Japan, the United States. They all came. It was a few dozen of them, and they did a conference there. A number of papers were published by those people talking about the probability that it was an electrochemical model for ball lightning. Freiberger wrote his original paper in I think it was 1996 or something like that. And there was a paper out of Japan talking about how they think microwaves could be producing them. We now know that microwaves do produce them in the lab. So 1994 really kind of kicked off interest again. That's how Massimo Teodoranti found out about it. He went to that conference, and he was a young astrophysicist at that time, and he was working at Medicina Radio Telescope near Bologna. He had gotten his doctorate in stellar physics at the University of Bologna, and then moved on to the radio telescope. And then those guys, the Stelia Montebenoli, who's now at the Italian National Academy of Sciences, was running the telescope. They got a team together from there. And then in 2000, 2001, 2002, they did, I think it was like 3 weeks. And that's when they got these observations I was describing. The controversy arose from the third field study they did. The senior physicist they brought, they had from the Medicina Radio Telescope, Matteo Leone, Dr. Leone. He there was a dispute on site about a particular observation, and Dr. Leone had a telescope, and when he was given the coordinates for where a light phenomenon was being reported by another crew member, he drew his telescope to the source and he identified a car. Now, he wrote and then there's been a lot of argument about that particular observation among those scientists. And basically it came down to whether or not there was a phenomenon occurring in the similar area, but at a different point. So they, like Teodorini argues that Leone misidentified the car as what they were talking about. Another doctor of, I think she's a doctor of biology, actually, Dr. Marcia Adams was on set. She was like videotaping, and she did a paper that was presented at a conference in 2006 where she says that the triangulation she estimated, it was like on the same latitude, but it was like, you know, whatever number of degrees off. So he was just slightly off. Anyway, Leone published a series of complaints about the papers that Teodorini was writing, not publishing, but just they were posting online. And he correctly made a number of corrections to Teodorini's paper. One of them was that Dr. Teodorini didn't account for the type of film he was using, so he overestimated the power source of the lights, so he adjusted that. And Dr. Leone had a specific grievance about this particular light that he had seen through the telescope and was resolved to be a vehicle. In his paper, he says, like, there is a real phenomenon. He himself is heavily involved in like UFO groups, but that was the major controversy. Teodorini did the adjustments to his work that Leone suggested, and that's how he published his paper in 2004 through the Journal of Scientific Exploration using the adjustments. But since then, there has been a lot of controversy about the car headlights interpretation of the phenomena at Hessdalen. There's been a bunch of papers. What's interesting to me is that Dr. Leone, who initially made this observation of the car headlights in one instance, has no argument about there being a real phenomenon occurring in the valley. But a lot of critics take his paper without context to say that he was saying that all observations were car headlights. So that's sort of a rundown, maybe a little bit too exhaustive, but a rundown of sort of the controversy and the background and stuff in Hessdalen.
Mm-hmm. Now, getting back to the Condign Report, but also I guess the Condon Report, which people shouldn't conflate. Mm-hmm. But they did say some remarkably similar things, right? And they also alluded to military applications, and that the military should seek to preempt Soviet attempts to do the same.
Yes. There's David Clark has actually Dr. Clark has written about this, particularly the name of the report, because the real name is Unidentified Aerial Phenomena in the UK Air Defense Region. And then the code name that they assigned to it was Condign, Condign. But the correct pronunciation of that word in UK English is Condign. So first of all, it makes it hard for a lot of English speakers to say it. And then when you say it with an American inflection, you're saying it almost identical to the University of Colorado report from 1969, Condon. So Condon, it makes it so confusing. So David Clark says there's no proof that they intended to mess around like that, but it seems like it might have been part of the defense intelligence kind of wink thing. So David Clark sort of has identified that name being hard. So I typically now say UAP in the UK ADR because I hate that name, Condign, because like to say it right, Condign sounds ridiculous. No one knows it by that, but that's correct pronunciation. And then to say Condign, it sounds like you're saying Condon, which is the other report. So it makes it tricky, and that's sort of stuff that you might expect. And David Clark's talked about that. But the Condign report from 2000 does directly state that they are worried that the former Soviets, now Russians, were ahead of Western governments in plasma technology because they had been actively studying the UFO phenomenon as ball lightning, and they had identified, it says specifically, the link between UFOs and plasma phenomena, and they are developing plasma-related technologies that can include things that we are familiar with in the present day, like fusion power. They say like radar reflecting decoys, which the US Navy now has, plasma, they call them plasma UFOs, and they're just lasers get crossed, they create a plasmoid, and that gets picked up by radar, or the targeting missile goes for that. So the report really emphasized, like, whatever, if these are like, it doesn't really matter what we say we're certain the exact nature of them. We've got to get on this. We've got to get on the plasma thing, because this, he says, publicly published physics papers in the Soviet Union are explaining these things that we haven't even touched on yet, and we have to get on this. So that's really an important part of this whole thing, that the plasma technology is clearly very closely tied into all of this, and that might be a strong underlying current through all of this from a national security perspective.
Yeah. And the other thing is the fear that the Soviets might try to stage UFO sightings in order to clog up the American, in the case of the US, but I guess the British had similar fears that the Soviets might try to clog up reporting channels in lieu of a sneak attack, right?
That is such an interesting and compelling point, that argument is presented in detail in the CIA's formerly classified, now Freedom of Information Act requested Robertson report, January 1953. After 1952 in July, there were 2 days in July where, in quotes, UFOs were occurring over the national capital in the United States. The president, Truman demanded to know what was happening. Fighter jets were scrambled. We have testimony from the pilots, again, not science, but it's worth looking at with this modern science available. They were saying, we're surrounded. I'm surrounded by balls of light. What do I do? The radar operator in his text says, like, the commander on site did not respond to the pilot because he did not know what to tell him. And these radar operators were going out of the towers with binoculars, looking at the lights as they're seeing them on their screens. So that, and then Truman demanded to be briefed what was happening. I think it was the Secretary of State, but it might have just been his personal secretary. Anyway, a secretary wrote a autobiography about the event, including the event, and he says that President Truman was briefed that the appearances were caused by electrified temperature inversions. And what is really stunning about that is in 2021, Dr. Gerson S. Paiva, who had produced the ball lightning phenomena in 2007, ball lightning like phenomena in his lab in 2007, wrote a paper that was published in the Journal of, I think, Solar Terrestrial Physics. And the entire paper is about how electrically active inversion layers can produce these luminous phenomena under certain conditions. And I have no knowledge of him being aware that that is actually what was told to Truman at the time. But anyway, so these events were occurring. It was taken as it was the first time the CIA, everybody took it seriously after that, because that was sort of like the 1803 L'Aigle meteor fall. It was like so many people saw it. It was like the president was demanding to know what was happening. CIA took it seriously. They wrote the Robertson report. So they identified seems like, and they say instances of that, it goes into great detail. This report is really cool, the Robertson report. They talk about instances of Foo Fighters were cited. They identify that Foo Fighters were glowing balls of light. They would follow the aircraft closely. They say, we believe that these are electrostatic forces. We think that these are electromagnetic phenomena in the atmosphere. We aren't certain how they operate, but it's a mystery of nature. So the exact mechanisms don't really matter. And what you pointed out, they say what does matter is the ability of radar operators to distinguish between these phenomena and actual Soviet threats, and also the threat that perhaps the Soviets would be able to create and control these phenomena and use them, or just take advantage of a natural occurrence as it happened. But both things they identified, that maybe the Soviets could even create these things and then create a panic and all these things. And the reason that they did that was because the observations that were being made in Washington in July through civilians calling in to report their observations of these phenomena, it literally, as you referenced, clogged the military's communication channels to the point where the military was unable to communicate with other militaries within itself, the leadership. And they identified that as such a grievous threat that they had to do something about it. And it really forced them to get into it and figure out what was happening.
Yeah. Related to that, are you aware of any solid confirmed cases where governments, either American or British, or I guess also Eastern Bloc, have explicitly and deliberately used UFOs as part of a psychological operation?
That's a good question. Maybe
the Benowitz case might be a candidate, but I'm not sure exactly how solid that is, because it does rely on the testimony of Doty.
Yes. My understanding of the Benowitz case, that would be an excellent example of perhaps a isolated event, because what is clear from that event is that Paul Benowitz was listening in inadvertently to military communications from his home using amateur-built radios. He called them saying he thought he was hearing UFO communications and stuff, and then they realized, wow, this civilian is using a home-built radio next to our base picking up classified signals. If the Soviets find out that you can just rent an apartment near military bases and just use amateur radio equipment to pick up our communications, that's a huge problem. So they started engaging with Benowitz. Now from there forward, it becomes unclear, like, was it just the leadership on that particular base that was involved in manipulating Benowitz? Was it only Doty? Did it go all the way up the chain of command? And that's what we don't know about that. But it was being used by at least Doty, it seems. On a bigger scale, there is a book by the chief historian of the CIA, Richard F. Hines. He published in 1997 what's the title? The title is like The History of the CIA's Involvement in the Study of UFOs, 1952 to 1994, I think it was. I have it on the website, direct link to the original text. He defines in detail exactly what we're talking about from the Robertson panel report. A lot of the issues that they identified were the psychological. So he talks in detail about how the CIA says we have to keep UFOs really secret. And he talks about how that caused them a lot of problems later when these documents started getting declassified through Freedom of Information in the 70s. Cool thing about the Robertson report that was really significant is that it was written before Freedom of Information laws, modern ones, had been passed. So they didn't realize that when they were talking in such explicit language about what they were thinking and doing, that it would be released later. Richard Hines, the formal CIA, like the CIA historian's chief historian, he talks about, okay, so the CIA identified, like, we got to keep this secret because of the psychological components, because it's like the objects themselves are not a threat, but the way that they can influence public psychology is a huge problem. Jason Colavito, actually, I'm just remembering from recalling my website, Jason Colavito wrote extensively about this exact thing, the Soviet use of UFOs in propaganda to destabilize Western governments. So Colavito has actually done extensive work on this subject, so we can be confident that the Soviets have used UFOs for propaganda effects in the exact way that the CIA had originally identified in early 1953. So it's clear that there is knowledge of the potential issues with this whole thing. they are sort of messing around on that front. So I think it's something I'm not super personally familiar with, but I have cited extensively material that gets into it in detail.
Yeah, the Colavito's research into this, if I recall correctly, he was alluding to Soviet use of the ancient astronauts myth. Is that right?
Yeah.
Or,
At least in large part, yes. Jason Colavito has researched extensively on that sort of whole side of this, and that propaganda effort, as far as I can tell, was, from what I can recall, was not necessarily like, oh, UFOs are ball lightning and we're going to use them as ball lightning. It was more like a deeper level. We're going to try to destabilize Western governments through encouraging kind of like racist psychologies and stuff, through advocating for these alternate history models and things like that. So that is a very meaningful distinction.
mm-hmm. So it was a Soviet active measures campaign.
Right.
Yep. Now, were the British and US governments, do you think, when they allude to the role of atmospheric phenomena, it seemed like in these reports they were making it seem like a very likely explanation. Do you think that they were just making a stab in the dark, given the ignorance about ball lightning at the time, or do you think that there's something deeper that they're not telling us about science that maybe they've uncovered and they're referring to, but it's still classified? Is that possible?
Well, that's certainly possible. Rather than initially speculating, I'll point directly to what is verifiable through the sources. The UAP and the UK ADR report, specifically the author cites publicly available peer-reviewed published physics papers in the Soviet Union as one of his sources. So he was looking in the journals in the Soviet Union when these physicists, and I have a number of those papers actually, some significant ones by a physicist named Gaidakov. There are a few others as well, but they were just talking right past where we are right now in like the 60s, 70s, 80s. They're just talking about the physical electrostatic, the math that describes, oh, when it's the ball lightning that people think is a UFO is following an aircraft, it's an electrostatic process. And, now in experiments, we actually have the exact mechanism we can replicate through electrostatics, the orbiting, the staying at a fixed distance. That's an inverter magnet. You can create that effect very easily. So they're just talking right past us. Like, they're just deep in it. They're saying in the Soviet peer-reviewed journals, and it's interesting the difference from Western science. So that, like, a lot of these journals are citing like, oh, esteemed physicist XYZ witnessed ball lightning while on a plane and it was following the tail. So I'm going to infer the properties of ball lightning from that observation. In Western science, the take nobody's word for it thing, you see there's a very big difference there, where it's sort of like, well, it's just an eyewitness reports, we aren't even going to look at it. Now the phrase trust but verify, it's actually, I was reading a bit about, it's originally a Russian phrase. And so maybe there's a bit of a cultural thing there. So it's fascinating to me to look at these peer-reviewed papers where the physicists are just totally ignoring the culture that's going on around UFOs. There is no reference to it because they're just talking about the pure physics, and they're like, we're making skirmions in the lab, we're producing ball lightning like phenomena in the lab, it's experimentation. And then in the Soviets case, it was like decades and decades ago that they were just doing this exact thing. And the modern fusion reactors using the torus, the tori, the torus configuration, that's from the Soviet Union based on their plasma physics that report identified. They were way ahead. And now Western science is using Soviet designs as the most likely way to operationalize fusion power. So there's something going on there for sure. And it's unclear to me. I don't want to speculate on whether there is like secret science and stuff. Certainly there is. I don't know, obviously, personally about that.
Yeah. But what do you think are the dangers of excessive secrecy or denial when it comes to the interest in ball lightning? Like, what are the ways that it can backfire, even just from a scientific context or also from a national security context?
Yeah, well, okay. So the biggest one to me that was really floored by. I'm a progressive. I'm a social democrat. I'm very interested in conserving the environment. I mentioned my grandparents' farm. It's in an ecological reserve here in Ontario. It's 185 acres. Half of it is swampland. It's in a pristine condition, and I'm doing everything I can to ensure that it stays that way, because it cleans all of the water all the way down the system down to Ottawa. It's like the top of the water system. So I walk around, I canoe through these swamps and stuff. I see the beauty in nature, the complexity, the concentration of life, and it overwhelms me with beauty. And then I go onto Google Maps and I look around with the satellites, and I look at the remotest forests in British Columbia, and there are just tiny little tendrils of original growth trees left in the highest mountains. We have stripped away basically everything. And the biggest thing here, that I don't fault science for this, because I agree with, you can't take anybody's word for it, but a consequence, if the explanation that these observations are aliens, if that stigma prevented people from seriously looking into ball lightning starting in the 50s, when the CIA started identifying that it was ball lightning, if fusion development has been postponed for decades because of that stigma, and we were not able to operationalize fusion up until now when we could have decades ago, the loss of life, and it really is a stunning possibility. I don't like to dwell on that side of it, but just because you raised it, that is the one thing that I think about, and it makes me just very sad to think that maybe the stigma from all these people saying, oh, it's aliens, that might have prevented us from switching to it's not infinite clean energy, like all this stuff, like even that, like, oh, UFO 0 point energy, it's like, it's not 0 point to do fusion power, but like, because people say, oh, UFOs 0 point, if you say like, oh, fusion, it's like what the UK report says. And if that stigma prevented the application of fusion decades ago, that would be a very sad historic reality.
Yep. You mentioned oh, 1 second. Well, this question's about institutional memory. So sometimes information can get lost. For example, I remember reading about they were trying to do something on nuclear weapons here in the US, and they had some component that they needed to replace, but they couldn't remember how to do it. And they had to consult one of the guys who had worked on that. He was like really old, and luckily, they found him and he was able to help. But
okay.
but there's like this whole sort of memory hole that had been left in the Department of Energy. And sometimes it's possible that information and expertise, they just get lost. So how strong do you think the institutional memory is about ball lightning, like within the military or the government?
That's such an intro. I've thought about that myself, but I don't know if I've ever heard somebody else reference it in that way. It's okay. It's something that I have thought on extensively, and it's not citable in the exact same way as other things. Just to sort of infer from what I've seen, I would say that it has been lost largely. I don't think there's a huge conspiracy going on. I think that, exactly as you're saying, this got like, originally they identified the threat, they started dealing with it, it got compartmentalized and stuff. And I don't think that a majority of people in the government think that it's the UFOs are ball. I don't think that maybe nobody is left in there thinking that. I don't know. And my speculation about what has occurred in the last 5 years or so, since the 2017 article, I think I have a strong suspicion that the Trump administration, I mean, there are confirmed papers about this. The national security infrastructure identified the incoming Trump administration as a potential national security threat in some respects. Stunning as a reality that the president could be seen in that way by the national security institutions that he has oversight over technically. But I would speculate that since we have seen Trump's director of national intelligence, John Radcliffe, started coming out saying like, we're seeing these things on the systems, they're flying all over the place, and this is the director of national intelligence. It's like, why are you encouraging people to think about UFOs like that? It seems like they might not have transmitted that institutional knowledge forward. I can't say that that's for sure. It's just something that I've speculated on, and your question really brought it to mind. And I think that there really is something there.
Mm-hmm. And that also gets to Obama's comments that you cited earlier.
Yeah.
Were those comments made after his term was over, or?
Yes. Yeah, that was in 2021. So
Okay.
it was many years. Yeah.
Yeah. So was he possibly was he transmitting something from the government, even though like he was out of the government by then, but was he expressing a view within government, or was he just repeating maybe a popular sentiment that had arisen out of the Nimitz encounters and stuff like that?
Yes, I'll be very clear on the that it is speculation. My impression of what was going on there. So former CIA director John Brennan came out and gave that interview on that podcast where he says like, we might start seeing some weather phenomena that might start explaining some of these UFO things. And then he says some of these observations might even constitute something that some might say constitute a different form of life. And it's like, what the heck are you talking about, former CIA director Brennan? That's insane. And then Obama coming out saying like, oh, there are things in the sky. And the thing that my impression is that these are people who were, and this is a speculation. My speculation is that these are people who were briefed on the subject. They probably got some kind of rundown that it's like atmospheric electricity. It's under use. There's a threat from making that public because of, the propaganda or something. I don't know exactly. And then I think that Obama and Brennan and all the other folks who I think probably were in that chain of communication of the subject that got maybe disrupted by the Trump administration, I think they were trying to get ahead of what they saw as potentially an inevitable final breakdown of this, the secrecy around the subject. That's how I interpret that. And I'm going to be very clear. That's my own personal opinion. That's not something I can cite.
Yep. Based on your researches, is it possible to give a kind of rough estimate for the proportion of UFO sightings that are attributable to ball lightning and similar phenomena, or does the lack of understanding of these phenomena still preclude assigning a probability to it in terms of the proportion of sightings?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Now, I think that my closest way, my most sort of reliable way of making that estimation would be to look at stuff like the works of John Allen Hynek, or J. Allen Hynek, and Jacques Vallée, because in their works there were like the UFO phenomenon 1972 by Hynek, he is referencing only reports that through his research through Blur, his work as the investigator for Project Blue Book under contract, the reports that he saw as having high credibility through what he identified multiple witnesses, a variety of other factors. And those are the reports that in his book he talks about. And those are the ones that, based on all available descriptions in the peer-reviewed publications about ball lightning, he is describing literally exactly what modern papers are describing through observations of ball lightning phenomena. So if we infer from that so Arthur C. Clarke has written about this too. In 1959, he wrote a paper where he talks specifically like, because the UFOs seem to move instantaneously, they turn instantly and all this stuff. They don't seem to be physical things. And he says hardcore unexplained UFOs may be plasmoids, ball lightning. And then later in life, he talks about how he thinks atmospheric phenomena are responsible for some UFO sightings. So if we take all of that together and we think like, oh, okay, these high credibility sightings that seem to perfectly describe identically what modern science is showing ball lightning would look like, and J. Allen Hynek specifically says in his work, these eyewitnesses have no idea what they're describing. A lot of them have no interest in UFOs. They just are completely confused. They just want to know what it is. And here's how they describe it. You know, it's a light, it's a luminous phenomena, it's self-illuminated. It looks like a neon glowing watch or something. So based on that, if those, as Arthur C. Clarke says, hardcore unexplained UFOs, like the true core of the phenomenon is actually these ball lightning phenomena that have the traits that are being described, then it would follow to say that the 2 to 5% that has historically been described as like the genuine UFO reports would be potentially these phenomena.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you think that the Skinwalker Ranch saga is likely related to genuine ball lightning or anomalous atmospheric effects at all, potentially? Despite, I think I already know what you think about the Skinwalker Ranch saga generally, like the sociology of it. But
Yes.
do you think that there could have been some precipitating events which then, just got blown out of proportion, but that have some basis in reality?
Yeah.
In the way that
Okay.
we've been talking about?
Yeah. Dr. Teodoran's written about this kind of thing. Michael Persinger, a professor from University of Sudbury here in Ontario, a psychology professor, actually wrote extensively about UFOs as well. And he, in the 80s, was writing papers about how he thinks that they might be a product of geophysical processes, geophysical manifestations of electricity and magnetic fields and things like that. Teodorani's talked about how there seem to be locations on Earth with a higher frequency of the phenomena. And then you have more recent peer-reviewed papers about things like the third man factor and isolated psychosis, which is something that can occur at high latitudes in mountain climbers. And possibly there's a geophysical mechanism. That's speculative. We don't know what the explanation is. We just know that this occurs. So there are instances of sudden onset hallucinations, and that's in the academic literature. It's being studied just in the last 5 years in a degree of intensity. I think that there's a plausible physical mechanism through these, geophysical processes that could explain some of these localized, reporting occurrences that are at a higher than average frequency. That said, Skinwalker has 0 peer-reviewed publications, so I would never say, oh, that's happening there. If there is something happening there at a higher than average rate, then I would speculate that maybe there is sort of like a localized thing happening that's a geophysical thing. But again, I would never say that is what's occurring. And as I've emphasized, I think that any individual instance of a UFO sighting, most likely every time, the most likely is misperception, hallucination, or hoax.
Yes. You mentioned Persinger, though.
Yes.
What are some of the controversies around him?
Oh, geez. Yeah. I think that, well, okay, so him having these papers where he says like he thinks, and this was in the 80s, right? He was saying like, oh, I think that these objects might actually exist and they might actually be the product of these geological processes. Just saying you think UFOs exist as a physical object with the characteristics that the UFO eyewitnesses report, once immediately that's going to bring skepticism for good measure. So that brought him some notoriety. It was only 2014 the ball lightning was proven to exist. So this is like decades before ball lightning was even proven. So he's saying ball lightning is real and UFOs are ball lightning. So, he got a lot of heat for that, and reasonably so. And another thing that he got in a lot of controversy around was his work related to the influences of electromagnetic fields on human cognition. And he built a device in his lab that he was colloquially known as the God helmet, which was a helmet you test subjects would put on, and then he would move around the electromagnetic levels in the helmet that was custom built, and then they would report experiences related to the fluctuating electromagnetic fields that he had published in papers. And then the results seem to indicate that these fluctuating electromagnetic fields may be producing similar effects to what people sometimes describe in proximity to UFOs. It might be similar to what people describe in some of these, the Virgin Mary apparitions and stuff like that. Now, the very important part of that is that those experiments have not been directly reliably replicated, in part because it was a custom device and all this stuff, but we cannot say with certainty that that is the case. So he was got a lot of controversy for that as well, because he was proposing mechanisms for things that have historically been highly contentious between skeptics and believers, and the going trend is to simply fully debunk that those things occur at all. Like, there are no real objects that are UFOs. Like Dr. Halperin is very clear about that, that he doesn't think that there is a true object at the heart of the mystery. And that's the scientific position to take, I think, until these more remarkable ball lightnings have been, providing that they do exist, when they are finally captured via high resolution spectral optical sensors, then we can say, okay, this is what's happening. So that those are a couple of the things that Dr. Persinger got into trouble for.
Yeah, but what's the most compelling evidence for physiological interactions between these sorts of phenomena and the nervous system? So
yes,
David Halperin talks about how some sort of stimulus, mundane stimulus, could set off some memory or meaning in the person's mind.
Yeah.
But this is here we're talking about instead some kind of electromagnetic interaction that goes beyond that, right? So it's inducing some sort of physiological effect. And is there much evidence for that?
There's so the something called the Haunting Project, and it's God, I don't remember the university, but I have the links anyway. It's a university project. They have demonstrated that there is compelling evidence through a variety of peer-reviewed papers about electromagnetism that there are interactions between electromagnetism and physiology, and that some of the effects that Dr. Persinger described could be plausible. So that's sort of that one thing. You can then sort of pivot and look at a more broadly peer-reviewed papers about the physiological effects of electromagnetism on the human body from a technological perspective. There are a number of papers on that talking specifically about how different wavelengths have different effects. So we know that electromagnetism does have interactive elements with the physical body. The real contentious stuff is the sort of abduction style stuff. And so on that front, maybe the most interesting stuff that I've seen on that are peer-reviewed papers published in natural science journals about lightning strike victims. Now, these papers talk specifically about people get struck by lightning and then they wake up sometime later randomly with amnesia of what occurred. And it's like one of them I was reading just says, if you find somebody outside unconscious and they wake with amnesia, it is likely that they were struck by lightning. That experience of awaking after a luminous object approaches you, sometime later you awake and you have amnesia, and then you later remember, in quotes, what happened when you had the amnesia. That's the prototypical UFO abduction experience. And then you fill in the blanks with a hypnotist who's prompting you to say it's aliens. So if when you look at the peer-reviewed papers about lightning strikes and you see, once again, descriptively, just like with ball lightning, descriptively identical to what's being described, but the explanation, of course, is entirely different. So, on the one hand, you can say like, well, they're saying it's aliens, all this stuff. Let's throw the whole thing out. Another thing is that there's actually a plausible natural mechanism that could explain some of these things. And, we know that ball lightning is a atmospheric electricity effect. It's very high energy levels and stuff. So it would make sense that people would sort of react as if struck by lightning by close proximity to these objects. And it's worth noting too that the UAP and the UK ADR report specifically talks about how they think that these objects can electrostatically couple to objects and even people. And there's the coupling mechanism is well understood. There's in just the general electromagnetism, it's the study of electromagnetism, it's coupling mechanism. Then there's I think it's called the person or the object receiving the energy inflow is called the victim. So the victim of the UFO becomes unconscious, wakes up later with amnesia, fills in the blanks. And, Valet, very controversial. We obviously don't like a lot of things that he's said, but he makes an interesting point where he says like a lot of these historic fairy encounters where you get taken to fairyland, it's like somebody, sees a luminous being, blacks out and then awakes later with a recollection of going to Magonia. So there's some interesting parallels there, and I would point people to those things as possible plausible mechanisms that might explain some of these things.
Yep. Are there any really sort of famous cases in ufology that you think are especially amenable to explanation by ball lightning or atmospheric electrical / plasma phenomena?
Well, the first one I'll cite is the 1966 Mino Air Force Base Blue Book report, because that report itself talks about this classic UFO behavior. These light illuminated objects come up to the airplane, they're tracking the airplane at an equal distance, in the same way that Gaidakov writes later about electrostatic forces causing ball lightning to track an airplane. And then the whole report goes through it. They were getting tracked on radar, all this stuff. And then the Blue Book report conclusion says this is most likely an atmospheric electricity phenomenon akin to ball lightning. Ball lightning can appear on radar, it can be tracked on radar, it can produce these effects, it can affect the electrical systems of vehicles and radios. So it's this US Air Force Blue Book report is specifically laying out all of these physical mechanisms that ufologists describe as the cause of, caused by UFOs, and it's the coupling mechanism that produces the according to the UAP and the UK ADR report, it's the coupling mechanism that causes these interferences with the operation of electrical systems. So I would point to that one as the primary example, and then because it's definitive speculatively, I can point to some others. People don't, the 2004 Nimitz event, it's so well studied and talked about that I don't think there's any value. If the information was available to resolve it, it would be resolved. So it's unresolvable. I don't know if it's helpful to be saying like, oh, I think it was this or that. I will say there is a possibility that the object that was observed, if not something mundane, and it is far more likely that it is a misperception of something mundane, like a missile or whatever, a plane in the distance, all that stuff, that's far more likely. It's possible that the white ellipsoid that seemed to be bouncing around over the water, producing a roiling effect, that's what you can produce that in a lab with an electromagnetic emitter above a water source. The object's shape itself, it looks identical to some of the objects that were produced by the Max Planck Institute for Plasma Physics in their ball lightning experiments. The David Hambling, science writer, has written about how the Soviets in the early 90s were engaging in military experiments trying to potentially control and move plasmoids through phased array radar. Phased array radar is the exact radar system that they were testing through the Aegis system at the time, and it would have been inadvertent, but because the phased array radars, you can zoom in, zoom out, concentrate the beam of energy. Conceptually, it would be possible maybe to actually, and that would maybe explain the movement to the cap point. It would actually be the radar gets moved to the cap point, the plasmoid gets pulled along with the radar. So I mean, you can kind of go in as far as you want and try to figure this out. I'm not going to say that is what happened. It's far more likely it was a series of mundane things, but it does make me think once you see all the experiments, you see the papers, you see that the observations are similar to what they're described in not only the ufology stuff, but also in the modern papers. Like, I think about it, but I do hesitate to actually try to start explaining individual cases that don't actually have sufficient information to resolve them, because I think it just it distracts from the actual papers that I think people should be looking at first before sort of trying to convince people that certain cases are ball lightning.
Yeah. Are you aware of any Chinese military studies?
I am not. The 2014 paper that proved ball lightning was completed by researchers in China. I think that's notable, but I don't know anything about what China might or might not know about the actual nature of as the UAP and UK ADR report described, the connection between UFOs and atmospheric plasma.
Yes. Do you think that there might be a correlation between, if you were to look at like the so-called high strangeness cases, would they have a higher chance of involving ball lightning?
Well,
triggers.
Yeah. Okay. Well, okay. So that's something that I actually have seen in like Skeptical Inquirer magazine. Dr. Joe Nickel has written a lot of stuff. He's a pretty neat guy, and he wrote a paper called Dispelling Demons, and it's about how he takes a case study as an example, a house that's known to be haunted, and he goes into detail about all the strange things, and he cites the most standout thing that ever happened in this house was a blue tubular object came out of the chimney and whipped around in the room and then went back into the chimney. And then he says in that, he's like, the description is essentially what you would see in the papers about ball lightning. And, the person at the place attributed it to a ghost. And, you can look at the peer-reviewed papers and you can see that the chimneys, there's a lot of eyewitness reports of ball lightning coming out of chimneys. And it seems like the chimney itself maybe can act as like a wave guide or something like that. So maybe that could explain it. Anyway, that mechanism is proven. It's just that we have a bunch of eyewitness reports. Sounds like ball lightning, So this whole thing with electromagnetic phenomena, maybe they create these impressions of like the Haunting Project talks about like these kind of ghost sensations and things like that. Maybe if it's like these luminous beings are coming out of chimneys, like, ball lightning, probably, if that actually isn't just a misperception or hallucination or whatever, which is more likely in any individual instance. I think that there's compelling reasons to think it is certainly possible that a lot of these paranormal high strangeness type things maybe are connected to sort of transient electromagnetic events. I've thought about that a fair bit. Once again, this is speculation, but like with Bigfoot encounters in quotes, often they're saying like, oh, I think, and it just gets so weird. It's just like, okay, yeah, whatever. Yeah, sure, you saw that. But they're saying like, oh, it was like the predator. Like I kind of could see it, but it was like blended into the background. And I could just tell it was looking at me. And like, these are the exact things that people in the experiments that are being written about in the, the haunting projects and stuff, that's the kind of thing that is being described as the experience. So it wouldn't surprise me if there is sort of an uncharted sort of transient electromagnetic type thing that sometimes occurs that can produce some of these experiences.
Mhm. And I think that's all that I've got in terms of questions, but I hope
Yeah.
that we can continue this conversation soon again.
Yeah, absolutely. I, I mean, yeah, I'd love to hear more about your positions on a few things as well. Like just one thing I was curious. Have you actually had an experience of any kind? Like what triggered your interest in the subject?
Oh no, I haven't.
Okay, yeah, yeah, me neither.
Yeah, so my interest has recently been rekindled because of I guess when I read David Halpern's book,
Mhm.
and well, I actually read Leslie Kane's book before that, and I thought that was good, but then I read like counter arguments against it, and then I was kind of in the market for explanations which explain things in terms of psychology and social forces.
Mhm.
So that's sort of, the Halpern book was really good on that.
Yes, and it's something I think I've mentioned to you briefly is that I deeply value those the psychosocial approach. I think that, like I mentioned, like Dr. Halperin has historically said he doesn't think there's an object at the heart of the mystery, and he's correct scientifically to think that. But if UFOs are, I mean, the hardcore unexplained UFOs are found to be ball lightning, I think everything that he has written on the subject is still 100% relevant because it's still the
Mhm.
projections and the interpretations, all of that is occurring on top of what would be a natural phenomenon. So I think that that is the primary lens that this subject should maybe be studied from a human perspective.
Mhm. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
And I guess I wanted to ask, you're a drug trafficker now, so
Ah,
are you living the Pablo
cultivator.
Escobar lifestyle?
Oh God, no. It's pretty much what you'd expect. I am an independent operator, and the business is dominated by three or four multi-billion-dollar companies who have closely engaged with the regulators, and so I'm not allowed to sell at my farm gate. I have to sell to a processor license holder, and they sell me or they buy my material from me at let me think for 1 second, 1/100th of what they resell it for. So I am not making a killing, unfortunately. uh,
Wow. Yeah, that sucks.
Yes, that said, I love what I'm doing. Like I mentioned, it's a large rural property that I get to sort of uh, be a steward of. A lot of what I enjoy about it is the natural wilderness. I mentioned it was 185 acres. Only 10 acres are cultivated. The rest of it is untouched, and so it's more about the lifestyle than the money. That said, I'm in the process of bringing a group of people together to get a higher class of license that allows for basically more intensive, well, not intensive cultivation, but a higher acreage of cultivation. I'm only cultivating a small portion of the 10 acres of with cannabis. So anyway, there's plans to increase the revenue, but right now I am not making a bunch of money, but I still love what I do.
But you can turn it into like a second Skinwalker Ranch.
Well, you know what? It's actually like the geological nature of the place is it's on the Canadian Shield, so it's on pure bedrock, and it's granite and quartzite and all of these types of rocks that are associated with, I mean, allegedly these locations with higher than average rates of observation. So I have never seen anything. I've never had any of these paranormal experiences or anything like that, but perhaps one day it will occur, and at least I'll have hopefully some context to not have it dramatically change the trajectory of my life.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you're being ethical about this, because a lot
Yeah,
of other people might just, you know, they could induce UFO sightings by just claiming that their ranch is you know, center of paranormal activity, and that's going to kind of prime other people to see that, attach that interpretation to anything even remotely anomalous that they see.
yes, yes. Well, and you know, I also don't make as much money as I otherwise would because I do farm organically. I am in the last 2 years, I've started to go like full permaculture. So my overall yields are reducing, but my day-to-day experience of actually doing the job has improved immeasurably. Not turning the soil, knowing that I'm not destroying those life cycles, all of those animals, and all that life in the soil. It's honestly just it's changed the entire experience, and it's worth it to me to have made that transition. So you know, it's kind of, you know, Brandon Fugel, he's worth $400 million. He drives a $300,000 Lamborghini, and he won't install a $15,000 sensor system that would actually be able to capture high enough resolution spectra to actually definitively identify one of these lights. So, you know, we know where his heart is. We know what he's doing. And, you know, I don't wish anything ill on the guy, but, you know, I question how he sleeps at night sometimes.
Do you wish anything ill on his Lamborghini?
Just the Lambo. Yeah, I sure. Yeah.
Maybe
That's
electrical systems will malfunction when it encounters an orb.
when a UFO. Yeah, you know what? Actually, that would be just come up if he's driving his Lambo into the ranch and a UFO comes by and maybe lifts him a few inches off the ground and just gives him a little scare. Maybe that would be fair.
Oh, that would be perfect. Yep.
Yeah, nothing serious, but yeah, just a little scare. Yeah. Well, it's been great chatting, Lewis. It's been awesome.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.